Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our weekly webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. Today is October 27th, 2019, and we have a couple of extraordinary stories, breaking stories to start with. But let me just tell you that we will not have a video feed from Helga due to a technical problem, but I assure you Helga is there and has quite a bit to say. So we're going to start with the two leading stories. One is the ongoing accelerating meltdown of the financial system, which you're not hearing about from the media. And the other is, just as an extraordinary development, the move to establish the right of a criminal inquiry for Attorney General Barr and the Connecticut U.S. Attorney, who now will have subpoena power and quite a bit more. So, Helga, why don't we start with this criminal investigation, the shift of that, because this has quite extraordinary implications, doesn't it?
Wow, this is really the big turn in the United States we hoped and knew would come, but now it's here. Now, you would never know if you just read and listen to the Western media in Europe, for example. But, I mean, they would tell you that now the final blow to President Trump has arrived in form of the testimony of the State Department official Taylor. But this is just absolutely untrue, and the coup plotters are completely on the defensive. Now, as you mentioned, Attorney General Barr has now a full criminal investigation against such people as Klepper, Brennan, Steele. And actually, this all brings up the question of what did Obama know and when. This is already coming up. And Barr has now the full power of subpoena. This will lead to a grand jury. And as things now look, there will be actually penalties and prosecutions for criminal behavior. So this is really incredible. There is a very interesting comment for readers who want to somehow grasp the significance of this, coming from Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson is one of the founding members of the WIPs. This is this organization of former intelligence officials to which also Ray McGovern and Bill Binney belong. And Larry Johnson wrote a commentary in the blog of the military strategic analyst Pat Lang, called Sic Semper Tyrannis, for those who want to check it for themselves. And he says it is absolutely not a coincidence that three events came together. One is the announcement of the criminal investigation into the coup plotters. He didn't say coup plotters, but in the various people who were involved in Russiagate against Trump and the coup in general. Secondly, the fact that Horowitz, who is the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, he announced practically at the same time that his report on the fraud against the FISA court will come out shortly. Now, remember, this was the FISA court is this very secret court which has the power to grant the right for surveillance. And obviously, they have been lied to many times by the various members of the Department of Justice and the FBI. So this report will come out shortly. And thirdly, that the government allowed the lawyer of General Michael Flynn to fully expose the criminal conduct in the procedure against Flynn. Now, this is also quite incredible because what she already announced, her name is Sidney Powell, she basically has material which shows that Klepper ordered the star writer of the Washington Post, David Ignatius, a very notorious member of this Anglo-American deep state, if you want to call it that way, where he on January 10th wrote a letter to David Ignatius, quote, take the kill shot on Flynn. So this happened on the 10th of January 2017, and 2 days later, this article appeared, which that then was very instrumental in in the prosecution and ousting of General Flynn. And remember, General Flynn was not just anybody, but he was the person who had gone to Obama already in 2012, telling him that it was various US official entities which had backed Al-Qaeda and ISIS and various groups, and had alarmed him to the terrible destabilizing effect all of this would have, which was completely dismissed by Obama. But if you want to know why the jihadists developed the way they did, and why ISIS took over, and why the United States was working with some of the same forces which had been responsible for September 11, I mean, this was all what General Flynn was on top of, and what he tried to fight against. And he was the national security advisor of President Trump, and he got basically ousted through this operation. So this is now all coming out. And as I said, Larry Johnson, who's a very senior analyst, basically says these three things: the criminal investigation, the Horowitz report, and the story around General Flynn, that they all come out together at the same time, is not a coincidence, but it means a complete rollback of this whole operation. And this is now really the big issue in the whole Russiagate and Trump question.
Helga, you mentioned Clapper. I want to just read a couple quotes from him on CNN, where he said that they were investigating Russian interference on the orders of President Obama. And he said, had he and others, should they have blown off what Obama told us to do? So he's now openly admitting that this came from Obama. This is quite a significant blow to this coup operation, isn't it?
Well, that's in a certain sense what happens when these things fail. That these the people who are conducting such coups and conspiracies, they don't have much honor among themselves, but they are easily ready to throw each other under the bus. And in this case, Clapper is clearly, pointing to Obama and saying we did all of this only because we were ordered to do so. So I think Obama will not be very happy about that, but here you go.
The Ukraine and impeachment hoax. I mean, we've been covering this in full, that this is not just about the so-called Hunter Biden corruption, but has to do with the whole strategic slant. But they seem to be thinking that people running it, Adam Schiff and Pelosi, that they have Trump dead to rights. But that's not true, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, first of all, whatever this Taylor testified, I mean, first of all, this was a star chamber testimony. With other words, the Democrats held hearings for 2 weeks, which they did not allow the Republicans to participate in. So it was exactly like what the British did in the American Revolution, which was one contributing factor for that revolution to occur. It was so bad that at a certain point, some 20 or so Republican congressmen barged into this hearing and broke it up, essentially, which caused a big freak out. But they said they would not tolerate this to go on. So what Taylor basically on the 22nd of October testified, basically saying that Trump would have told Zelensky that he would withhold financial money for security purposes unless Zelensky personally would take the microphone and say that basically he opened an to say openly that he investigated an investigation in Biden's role in 2016. And this was called by the by the media, the breakthrough testimony, this dooms the president and so forth. But I mean, this is all absolutely not true. First of all, President Zelensky of Ukraine already publicly said that there was absolutely no such quid pro quo. With other words, that indeed Trump did ask him to investigate and assist Barr in his investigation of Biden's role in 2016. But this was a formal request, and there was no blackmail, there was no tying that to military aid or holding such aid up. So this was a lie already there, counterposed by the president of Ukraine. So then naturally, what they also accused Trump of, that the president would have abused his power to run a back channel to Zelensky, including using Gordon Sondland, the new ambassador in Kiev, Kurt Volker, the special envoy to Ukraine, and Energy Secretary Rick Perry, and that he would also have facilitated a channel for Giuliani to investigate the interference in Ukraine on behalf of Hillary in 2016, that he would have misused, that Trump would have misused his power by basically asking Zelensky to help Barr to investigate all of this, and also that part of his crime would be to have recalled Ambassador Mari Jovanovic, and basically, you know, Biden's role in the firing of the prosecutor of his son, Hunter Biden, who was sitting on the board of this firm Burisma, which plays a very, you know, shady role in all of this. So all of these things should be looked at exactly the opposite way. Not only did Trump only do what is the absolute constitutional right of the US president to do, namely to conduct foreign policy with other presidents. So there was absolutely nothing wrong in that. But more interesting, the story becomes when you look at who are all of these people. Who is William Taylor, for example? I mean, he is basically one of, I mean, this whole apparatus, what we are really looking at here is the entire apparatus which had been deployed by, you know, one can say the neocons or Democrat neocons, that is sometimes not a difference. That apparatus, which after the collapse of the Soviet Union, broke all promises which were given to Gorbachev at the time, not to move NATO to the borders of Russia. This is the apparatus which was absolutely involved in regime change, in color revolution, in the Orange Revolution against Ukraine, later in the Maidan, but also in similar color revolutions in other former Soviet Union members of the Soviet Union. So this is quite a story, because this is, for example, Ambassador Jovanovic. She replaced the famous Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt, who was the ambassador in Kiev at the time of the Maidan coup. Remember that the phone call of Geoffrey Pyatt was leaked somehow when he talked with Victoria Nuland, and they basically said, we have to get our guy Yatsenyuk in there. And she also used this famous four-letter word against the EU. This word starts with F and ends with a K. So this is the apparatus. You know, and Taylor also has a career history. He was in the diplomatic work with State Department at the time, you know, of the 90s, when the shock therapy against Russia was applied. He was involved in various operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, in the time of the Ukraine color revolution. So what you're really looking at is this is the apparatus which was fully involved in trying to contain Russia by moving NATO to the borders, by trying to get regime change of all countries which were not in favor of basically toppling Putin. And this is now the apparatus which wanted to prevent Trump, who had said that he would try to have better relations. He said that as a candidate in 2016, and this was when this operation was already in full swing. And this is really the issue. And now this table is completely turned. So you can look at all of these developments exactly from the opposite side. And then you can actually see that the reason why Russiagate was made, why now the new phase the Ukraine Gate, which was supposed to become Ukraine Gate, why all of that is part of the same British instigated coup against Trump, because he wanted to improve the relationship with Russia. And now the table is completely turned. These people will be investigated. And I'm pretty sure that one threat will lead to another one. And the whole story, including what was the background of the coup in 2014 against Yanukovych, bringing in a government which was totally heavily infiltrated or mixed with Nazis of the Stepan Bandera tradition. So we're looking really at a very, very dirty story, which is now all coming out in the open.
I would encourage our viewers to go to LaRouchePAC.com, where on a daily basis, we've been writing stories about this, having videos on it, so you can get all the details that Helga just went through, which is quite significant. Now, as this is unfolding, Helga, we also have new reports coming out on what you've been covering for the last months, the escalation of the financial crisis, the likelihood of an implosion sometime not too far ahead. I think importantly in this was the Mervyn King speech, the IMF meeting, but why don't you give us an updated report on what's happening with the financial system?
Well, if you read the official financial media, there's almost nothing about this. But, we have absolute evidence, and you can actually investigate that yourself by going to the webpage of the Federal Reserve, and you look at the kind of financing they are doing. And then you find out that since mid of September, they have increased the so-called repo credit, that is the overnight lending of the Fed to various banks. That has gone up significantly. It was raised at a certain point from, I think, 60 to 75 billion per day. And now the level is at 120 billion. And, the volatility is absolutely still there. So, there there is right now, obviously, behind the scenes, there are clear signs. The insurance companies are in trouble because they have extensions to the derivatives. You have the US corporate debt. You have the inability of the central banks to keep the interest rate down. And so you have an extremely volatile situation where, you have now such financial gurus like Dirk Müller, who's called all the time Mr. DAX. He came out saying that we are in front of a giant new crash, and that the difference to previous situations is that all the regions of the world today are connected, and therefore we're sitting in one big boat. And he mentions as additional factors, that the real industry is badly affected because the German government, for example, goes against the auto industry. The German banks, the two major banks, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank, are in serious difficulties, to put it mildly. But I think there is an even more interesting dynamic going on, because we have warned against the fact that the neoliberal system is not working. As a matter of fact, my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, warned, that this system is finished. He made this famous video webcast on the 25th of July in 2007, where he emphatically said, this system is finished, and all we see now is the different aspects of it coming to the surface. Then, as people remember, after the secondary mortgage crisis in the United States in 2007, it came to the Lehman Brothers AIG systemic collapse mid-September 2008. And that would have been the moment to make a complete dramatic reform and eliminate the causes for this systemic crisis. But as we now know, they did not do this. There was a short-term discussion about the need to have a new Bretton Woods. Sarkozy, for example, said that under shock. But then at the later G20 meeting in November 2008 in Washington, the fix was put in, and the most gigantic bailout operation in history ever, I think it altogether came to $23 trillion, was put in motion. And naturally, all the tools of the central banks have been used up: quantitative easing, zero interest rate, even negative interest rate, money pumping to no end, and now these repo buying repo lending repo credits overnight. It's just the end of the system. But naturally, all of this did not just go in monetary bailout operations and so forth, but it was always combined with brutal IMF austerity. The European governments even put the black zero in their constitutions, the balanced budget. As a result, a lot of the real economy got destroyed. The living standard collapsed. And now we are in a situation where the consequences of this policy is leading to a mass strike phenomena in practically every corner of the world. I mean, what you see right now is that the financial policy has the effect of causing incredible social ferment in Chile. Chile, for example. Chile was always peddled as the model of the neoliberal economic system. And we already denounced that in an article in 1995, that this was a brutal genocidal austerity program and could not work. And now you had, in the last days, 2 million people in the streets in Santiago, more than 1.2 million people. And the entire nation of Chile has only 18 million people, so almost 20% were in the streets. So then you have Ecuador, Bolivia, Lebanon, Pakistan, Iraq, France, Germany, Ethiopia. In Argentina, today you have an election which is probably bringing in as President Fernandez and Cristina Kirchner as Vice President, which they are at a complete clash with the IMF. So I think what we are looking at is the beginning of the end of the neoliberal system, and this is really big.
Wow, it is quite exciting when you think about it, and it is global. It's something that they cannot stop. Now, at the same time, we saw the warnings from the neocons against Trump's moves to pull out of Syria, where they predicted horrible consequences, actually is turning into something quite the opposite again. We had the meeting of Putin and Erdogan, the stability now on the border. How does this look to you, Helga?
Well, I think the situation has clearly shifted, with the behind the scenes cooperation between Putin and Trump, which is clearly there. The announcement of Trump that he wants to pull out of supposedly endless wars the fact that Erdogan was in Moscow and clearly has an agreement with Putin, which includes the Adana process, which has been signed many years ago and allows for a certain amount of activity what Turkey was doing, and the fact that there is now the idea to include the Damascus government in the negotiations, which creates the real basis to solve this problem. Now, obviously, there are forces who are absolutely hysterical about that, and it doesn't go so clear cut because, for example, the Russian Foreign Ministry or Russian Defense Ministry rather, they accused that the United States military is smuggling oil out of the oil fields in Syria, and that they get a monthly revenue out of that of 30 million. Now, there was all of a sudden a call, well, the United States troops should go into the east of Syria to protect the oil fields against ISIS. But if you now look at this statement by Konashenkov, the spokesman of the Russian Defense Ministry, while that may be actually an effort by the military-industrial complex to prevent what Trump is announcing. But overall, the situation looks very good. It is recognized by many people, or at least a significant number of people in the West, that Trump has won. He has absolutely won. And that there is the basis for reconstruction. So therefore, I think this late proposal by AKK, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the German defense minister, to send the Bundeswehr into the northeast of Syria to protect a security zone, comes really late. Russia already said it's not needed. So I think the Bundeswehr is already overstretched. So I think this is a really unnecessary and almost impotent proposal, trying AKK trying to profile herself as the great strategist. But I don't think this will fly. I think the situation is changing. There is a complete realignment going on. I think Turkey, which obviously is still a member of NATO, insists that they have the right to do as much negotiations and dealings with Russia as they are doing with the United States. So the Turkish defense minister, Hulusi Akar, basically insisted that it was absolutely the right of Turkey to discuss with Russia the sale of Su-35 fighter jets. And when Erdogan was in Sochi, Putin showed him also the Su-57 stealth fighter jets. And there's discussion that they will manufacture even some parts of these in Turkey. So I think this is all going in an interesting direction. And the West, European countries, what they should do is, rather than opposing it, they should participate in the reconstruction of Syria, of Iraq, because these demonstrations show that the living condition for people in Iraq become intolerable. Afghanistan has only a chance to ever transform into a modern or more modern country is if there is real economic development. The same is for Yemen, this country which was the worst humanitarian crisis for a long, long time. The West should not continue to play these geopolitical games, but help in the reconstruction and join hands with Russia, with China, with Iran, to rebuild this region.
Well, speaking of geopolitical games, we also have this pathetic speech from Mike Pence attacking China, but it was responded to very strongly by the Chinese. And it looks as though there's some motion again on finalizing phase one. Say something about that, Helga.
Yeah, I think it could have been worse, but both the Chinese side And also the American side, they said that they are optimistic that phase one is actually going to be concluded. But, you know, I mean, when you all the time have such absolute violent anti-China statements like they have been coming from lately Vice President Pence, who just repeated the entire litany of accusations against China, it really doesn't help to create the kind of condition of cooperation between the two largest economies of the world, on which really much of the fate of the rest of the world depends. So the Chinese ministry answered to a speech which Pence gave in the Wilson Center very hard. They said, you know, also Pelosi, who had said something similar, that Pence and Pelosi and her likes are distorting facts. They are blinded by prejudice. They accused Pence's arrogance, prejudice, and lies. So these are all stronger words than one is used from the Chinese. So one can only say that this is all really counterproductive, because China is, you know, what China has done is an incredible economic miracle, which really helped to overcome poverty not only in China, but China has contributed 70% in poverty alleviation around the world. So, you know, I think this is really something of the past. And hopefully, if this, you know, opposition of Trump in the United States gets now investigated, then that will also take some of the wind out of the mills of these people.
Well, finally, we have a very delightful story coming from Sochi, the meeting that just took place between Vladimir Putin and more than 40 leaders of African nations. You've been talking for some time about the importance of the Chinese role in developing Africa. Now we see the Russians going in with big plans. Uh, how does this work out? What was it that Putin proposed? And obviously, it was well received by the Africans.
Well, this was a big summit involving Russia and all 54 African states. I think 50 or so heads of state were there, or I think all of the heads of state, 50 presidents, and they discussed a very far-reaching scope of issues, joint work in security, the fight against terrorism, the fight against dope traffic, but also economic cooperation. Russia concluded memos of understanding with about a dozen or so African nations that Russia will help them to build nuclear plants, nuclear power plants. They also have very broad trade and economic cooperation. And, you know, it was really a very exciting thing, because, you know, this was already raised by Putin almost 2 years ago at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, where he said that Russia will help to electrify and turn on the light in all of Africa. And this was a very big step in this direction. So you have now, besides China, Russia taking a leading role in the development of Africa. And I think this is very important in the fight against terrorism. And also, you know, if Africa will have nuclear energy, this is a very important step. So I'm very happy, you know, because soon the African nations will have more nuclear power than Europe. I'm not happy about that, but I think this is a good incentive, a kick in the behind of some of these greedy ideologues in Europe, that Europe will be sidelined completely and Africa will grow. For Africa, this is very good. For Europe, this is obviously very terrible. But I think this is optimistic. For example, Alexei Lidachov, the head of Rosatom, said, you know, for every dollar which we invest in nuclear energy or in other forms of energy, $2 will come out in terms of return. For every half megawatt electricity we build, there will be 2,000 new jobs. and they also discussed many scholarships for students from a dozen countries in Russia. And all of this is very good because, Africa, which is a huge continent, it's unbelievably big. And by 2050, it's expected that there will be 2.5 billion people. So the only way how that can become an economic powerhouse, which it must become, because otherwise we will have a refugee crisis of unbelievable dimensions, is to create hundreds of millions of new jobs for young people. And so Russia has done a major step in that direction. And Putin also canceled 20 billion debt, which still existed to the Soviet Union, which were not paid interest on in any case. So that is just canceled. So I think this is really good. This is good news, and people should not freak out about geopolitical competition, because it would have been the privilege of European countries or the United States for a long time to do likewise, but they didn't. And now China and Russia are doing it. So they should join hands with these countries rather than opposing it.
Well, to conclude, Helga, you've just presented a very impressive, sweeping picture of changes, the turning of the tables, as you said, against the coup plotters, the global bankers. What should listeners do to participate in this to make sure it's concluded successfully?
Well, I think they should help to get rid of the Green New Deal, because, if you think about it, this Green New Deal will blow out the financial system for good. It is the opposite of what some of these financiers and central bankers wish, that the green financing will lead financial streams into green technology and create a new boom and postpone or avoid the crash. The opposite is going to happen. Already now, Reuters warned that the spread of strikes and protests around the world will blow out the system, because it will force the governments to loosen up on the austerity, and this will make the investors very nervous, and that will trigger the crash. Now, if you look at these protests, these are already occurring without the climate-related packages. I mean, this is already, sort of just in quote, just the result of the neoliberal austerity. If you now would proceed with what von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, has announced, that she will implement legislation in the first 100 days of her office, which will basically force all industrial firms to only go into green financing, and that the banks, as Mark Carney has said at the Jackson Hole annual bankers meeting, that the central banks must dictate to the governments that only such green financing should take place. If they go ahead with that, the social unrest will blow up the globe. So this is completely untenable. So what you, our listeners and viewers, should do is join with the Schiller Institute. Contact us on our webpage. Get active with us. We have a mobilization to implement the 4 laws of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, the Glass-Steagall, banking separation. Then you need national banks in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, and you need a new credit system, a new Bretton Woods, which allows for credit financing of large projects like the new Silk Road projects around the globe. And then you need international cooperation as a model for future cooperation among states in working together on a crash program for fusion and international space cooperation. And then we can solve all of these problems. So I think the key thing is, if you look at the news and you see there are mass protests in Chile, don't think this is very far away. This is coming home very quickly, and we need the kinds of reforms I just mentioned, and then we can solve it. But we need people to get active and not sit on the fence.
And I'll emphasize it, even though you didn't, it's even coming home in Germany now. So Helga, thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, I hope we see each other.
Yes, okay.